Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad to see a full house to the Parsons Transdisciplinary Seminar. This is a collaboration of the Fine Arts program with the Vera List Center. It's the first time we're doing it this year. I'm really happy to see such good response to it. Today, the seminar always pairs two lectures with each other, one happening one Tuesday after another. Today, Pascal Gielen and Michael Hardt, and then the pair with it next week will be Oqui and Vezor, which we're really happy to have. Again, probably it will be as crowded as this, so arrive early if you would like to have a seat. Just to the structure of the program, we'd like to ask you to turn your cell phones off and to commit to being here with us for an hour for the public lecture, because it's a seminar after all. And after the presentations, there will be a brief public Q&A, after which we're going to take a break, and then only the students, there's going to be a book signing in that break, which we're really happy about, and after that, the students of the class will resume to our private conversation with the two lecturers. With this, thank you very much for being here, and I will hand it over to Karin Koni to do an introduction.
I'll do a second introduction, simply introduce the speakers, or attempt to do so as briefly as I possibly can. With us, as you know, are sociologist Pascal Gielen and philosopher Michael Hardt. Gielen will be the first speaker, and we'll talk about the exploitation of art in our post-Fordist economy, which very roughly can be characterized as by the rise of the service and white-collar worker and the general emphasis on the consumer, by specialized products and jobs and information technology. Very rough summary of post-Fordist economy. Hardt will then respond and argue that the post-Fordist context offers the possibility that artists' skills can be deployed in defense, production, and distribution of the common. You have a very abbreviated biography for both speakers. I just quickly want to remind you that Pascal Gielen is a professor of sociology of the arts at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He's also research chair of arts and society at the Fontys College of the Arts in Tilburg, also the Netherlands. Several of Gielen's books have appeared under the college's label Arts and Society, and among them are Being an Artist in Post-Fordist Society Times, which is available outside at intermission, and also The Murmuring of the Artistic Multitude, Global Art, Memory, and Post-Fordism, also on sale outside. He's currently working on Community Art and Beyond, The Political Potency of Trespassing. Earlier books that Gielen has written are Aesthetics for the Decision Makers, Art in Networks, and Cultural Good, among many others. He has also edited a special edition of the art journal Open, which was dedicated to the biennial as a global phenomenon and had a subtitle of Strategies in Neo-Political Times. And in fact, I believe it was that special issue and a discussion or a series of public events that preceded the publication of this special issue that introduced Pascal Gielen to Michael Hardt. Pascal was organizing a number of public events on occasion of the Brussels biennial, the first and only biennial that ever took place, and Michael Hardt was one of your guest speakers. Michael Hardt himself is a political philosopher and literary theorist based at Duke University, North Carolina. After graduating with a degree in engineering, he lived in Latin America, working for solar energy companies and also working for various NGOs in Central America after that. Eventually, he moved to the US and received a PhD in 1990 in comparative literature at the University of Washington. Hardt is the author of 3 immensely influential books, co-authored with Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri. The first one, Empire, 2000, offers an analysis of the current global power structures and relates them to the transformation of imperialism and the arrival of American dominance after the Vietnam War. Empire was followed by Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of the Empire in 2004, and Commonwealth most recently. In addition, Hardt is the author of Gilles Deleuze, An Apprenticeship in Philosophy, Labor of Dionysus, A Critique of the State Form, co-written with Negri, Radical Thought in Italy, and The Jameson Reader, and many other publications. As Andrea mentioned, after their lecture, there'll be a brief Q&A, and then again, some of the books that I mentioned will be on sale outside. So thank you very much for coming, and Pascal, why don't you come here? Thanks.
Okay, thank you also, Karen, for inviting me here today to give this lecture and have a small book presentation. I also want to thank Vera Solberg. I studied here 10 years ago for some months with her, and she was at that time she was very influencing me as a sociologist of art. And I certainly want to thank Michael Hardt that he went into the invitation to have a discussion here on post-Fordism. So what I'm going to do now is give, first of all, a kind of brief introduction in what is post-Fordism. It's what I call the educational part of the lecture. Afterwards, I go into a kind of hypothesis I put on this post-Fordism and how it is related to the art world. And then I will describe at the end the art scene as a part of the art world and as also a production unit in the art world. So first of all, excuse me for who is already involved or knows already very well post-Fordism, but I think it's very important also for the students to explain what is post-Fordism about. Okay, when we say post-Fordism, we also say or think about, of course, Henry Ford and Fordism. So I have to explain, first of all, what is the difference or what is the connection between Fordism and post-Fordism. Henry Ford, in a way, invented a kind of system which was based on what we call an economy of material products. What is important here is use value. For example, that a car can drive from point A to point B. So it has to be functional. That's a material project. Or a raincoat has to defend you against rain. That's the most important thing. So it has to be functional in a way. A product economy also is based on a typical way of working, what I call, in a very blunt way, material labor. Material labor is based on immobility. You go to work from 9 to 5 or in shifts. You go mostly to work for all your life in the same firm, etc. This is very important as a characteristic of this Fordism. You work with fixing working hours, 9 to 5. And what is important here is you have to do things. Even only putting one wheel the whole day in the car, it is doing. Doing is very important as a characteristic of Fordism. Post-Fordism is much more in the context of evolves in the context in the 70s in what we all know as the consumer economy or consumer society. What is important here in the consumer society is immaterial products which have a kind of symbolic function. So sign value is very important. Nowadays, we not only buy a new mobile phone because it doesn't function anymore, but because the design isn't fashionable anymore. So the sign value helps to accumulate in an economical system. I think this is classical, that we already know from some postmodern philosophers has written there about this. But what happens on the immaterial shop floor in labor practice? What we see there is coming up a lot of mobility. We don't have a job for all our lives anymore, but for 5 years, 7 years. We work at several places at the same time. For example, I live in Antwerp, which is in Belgium. It's 400 kilometers from Groningen, where I work and teach, and it is only possible, for example, for me because of the internet. So huge mobility. Flexible working hours, we all know what this is. We don't have to be there anymore between 9 and 5, but can choose our own working hours. Communication becomes up, it's very important, much more than doing. So also talking about what you're doing and explaining about what you're doing becomes involved. What is also important is that you can be detached very quick from one context of work to another context of work, and that you also be very adaptive, that you can see what is changing in the context, and that you can react in a very flexible way to it. So this is very educational, the difference between Fordism and post-Fordism. I sum up some characteristics, and I developed them more about this post-Fordist condition. One is, I mentioned already, is physical and mental mobility. This one sociologist, John Urry, we call him sometimes a sociologist of mobility, who has counted, for example, and it was already in 1999, he's written this book and made this study. He counted how many people are in the air at this moment now, and he came to the conclusion that there were 14 million people. So one small nation state is above here. So mobility is growing, and it was in 1999, so it is still accumulating, etc., etc. So the result or the effect of post-Fordist economy is this physical mobility. But what interests me much more is what I call mental mobility. Post-Fordist working is based on an economy of ideas. It is working with ideas. So, and the product is also, in a way, the idea. So what is important here is thinking, working with your head. And we all know when you work with your head, you can work at work, but also at home. You can work in bed, and even in the worst case scenario, at holiday. Because you can't cut off your head when you go out the shop floor. So when this economy of ideas comes in, you see a kind of hybridity of the private and the working space. And we all know that you can work even at night now, sitting at your computer. I, for example, respond papers of my students at night when I'm here in New York. At every place you can do. So working space and private space are mix up. So we get also not only flexible working hours, but even flowing working hours. You can work every time when you want. So that's even more than flexible. And some classical sociological studies on sociology of labor stress that it delivers a lot of stress to people and give also people a lot of depressions. And one of the results of this is, for example, an enormous accumulation of burnouts. And burnouts is sometimes seen as, or felt, when somebody has a burnout, is felt that you are empty, that you don't have any ideas anymore. But in fact, for me as a sociologist, it is the social context social context which wants that you have again and again new ideas. This is very important. So there's always a kind of stress, and now people around you which give you the moral or the ethical feeling that there is still something in your brain and you have to catch it, even if you can't catch it. This is really frustrating, and this is for me a basis for burnout. The frustration that there still is something in your brain somewhere, but you can't find it. So this is for me the idea of burnout and what is a syndrome nowadays, especially in creative and cultural industries, for example. But this sounds very claustrophobic in a way. But at the other side, post-Fordist labor is also gives you also a lot of freedom. Because until now, it is impossible to watch in your brain. So also an employer can't see if you're working or if you're not working. So it is possible that you are quite in love, etc., and can't bring good ideas at this moment. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, the employer. So it is impossible also, that's another thing, to measure the time to have a good idea. You can have a good idea in a second, or you can pretend you're working on it for months. So also this is a thing where you can play with. Also, you can keep your good ideas for when you're working for an employer and give them only in this firm half good ideas, bad ideas, and keep the good ideas until you have earned a lot of money to build up your own company and then use the good ideas. So you can juggle with this. You can play with ideas. And we all know, you can be lazy. You can do something per month. So there is also, in this post-Fordist context, a way of freedom, which is, I have to say, is very individualistic. It has nothing to do with unions, etc. It is an individual way of dealing with these conditions. Another thing, what is important in this post-Fordist context is communication. And I quote here one of my favorite philosophers, Paulo Virno, who says in Grammar of the Multitude, the book, that it was until the 70s normal to find these sentences on the shop floor: be quiet, people are working here. It is very important that, for example, even when a person only puts a tire in the car, that he has to be quiet because he has to concentrate on the work. Nowadays, Paulo Virno says, it's almost the opposite. On the shop floor, we see almost this quote, people are working here, speak, speak, speak. Communication is very important. So when this comes up, also the virtuosity of language is very important. And I think language in the broadest sense of the word. Also PowerPoint is a kind of performance. It's a kind of virtual virtuosity, or even a kind of theater, performing. So performing ideas is very important instead of doing. Or you have to do something, but also perform what you are doing. When communication comes in, interhuman relations are very important. It's not only in teamwork, for example, important that somebody has good ideas and is functional. No, also what he's saying, how he's saying, even how he or she is smelling is important in this total context. So then comes also, this is very important, informality gets involved in it. It's important also to get a drink after work, to get informed about other business, etc., etc. So, and also in this work is also trust, especially in an economy of ideas, but I comment this later. Trust, you have to trust each other, and this is important. So, I came up also that informality on the shop floor, which came up very much in the 1970s, is also in a way of control. For example, it is important, or it is functional to have an outward bond with your job, but it is also functional for your employer that he has a good talk with you after work, that he knows how it's with the family, if you're not involved in a divorce, or if you're not alcoholic, etc. Because thinking is central. And he has to know if, or she has to know if you are still have the opportunities to think. So informality is a kind of control system on this shop floor. Last characteristic I get into, And I have to be honest, a lot of those characteristics are mentioned, for example, by Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri in their books, but also by Paulo Virno. The last one is what is explained very nice by Paulo Virno is opportunism. He says that it is functional, it's very functional in a post-Fordist economy to be an opportunist. But he sees it as a very, in an amoral sense, not in a moral sense. He says opportunities is really literally taking opportunities. You have to take the opportunities. This is a very important characteristic and even quality in a post-Fordist context. Why is this important? Because this economical system, an important characteristic of this economical system is what they called chronicle instability. We live in a kind of project economy, or what Boltanski and Schiapella called a project city, even. Those sociologists call it like that, because we don't work anymore for a long life at the same place, but we jump from one project to another project. And this is a very interesting way of working, I say a very interesting way of work to observe as a sociologist, because what happens when you're working in a project? When you're working in a project, you first of all you give all the energy because there is a deadline, and you know that the project has to be finished. So it accumulates a lot of energy, but also time, etc. But another thing what is happening is when you are working in the project, you know it ends, so you're already thinking for the next project. And so while you're not always in, how do you say, you are not in the project anymore mental, because you're already thinking for another project. And this is what is also gives stress, of course, but which is also the basic condition of this work. So chronicle instability makes you thinking in a kind of opportunistic, I don't know, opportunistic way. You have to be aware of what are the next opportunities. So you have to be also aware of an always changing shop floor. You have to be aware of not expected changes and questions. I go through this. So in a way, opportunism is very productive, and again, it is seen as an amoral thing. It's not a moral or ethical thing. Okay, what is now, and now I go further. What's now the relationship between art and post-Fordism? I think when there are artists here in this room, I think they recognize a lot. I think an artist is a prototypical post-Fordist worker in a way. He works always with flowing work hours. We know that the romantic artist works at night at his garret and can work everywhere. He's also, and I go into this later, he's also ask always for his potency, especially in the modern art world or postmodern art world. People are asked for their ideas, not for their products. For example, when a gallery owner, commercial gallery owner, for example, gets involved in your work, he wants that he hopes that you will make still good work afterwards. But what is contracted, if you get a contract, is in fact the potency, the hope for a good work which will get after. So potency is very important in the post-Fordist context, but also in the art world. Virtuosity of language, when ideas are important or become even more important than the artwork itself, the virtuosity of language is very important. You have to talk about your work. You have to explain your ideas in a very good manner. So you have to perform also your ideas. And we can ask also the question if the artist is not a big opportunist. He has to take the right opportunities. But this parallelism between the art world and post-Fordism is maybe quite evident. The hypothesis I defend in the one of the books, The Murmuring of the Artistic Multitude, is in fact that the early modern art world is in fact the laboratory, or was the laboratory, for this whole post-Fordist economy. It is already in the end of the 19th century, I think, that this way of social behavior is introduced, conscious or not, by people like Marcel Duchamp, for example. The idea is very important, the talking around the object and not the object itself. And the social functional around this is for me a kind of laboratory. I don't argue it here in the lecture, but I argue in the book why I think this is a laboratory for this post-Fordist economy. But I see also other writers, for example, Boltanski and Schiapello, in The New Spirit of Capitalism, their book. They also say that the new capitalism, like they call it, that it's in the 70s embraced the artistic critique. And one thing of this artistic critique is this way of working. Being autonomous, being creative, being flexible, etc. What me interests more as a sociologist is that the social interaction based on the exchange of those immaterial goods. How does this social interaction function? How does it influence? How is a social interaction influenced when you deal in an economy of ideas? And when you deal with immaterial goods. First of all, maybe a question, what is typical for the art world nowadays is still the question, what is a good idea? What is nowadays a good idea in the art world? This question is also relevant because also in general a post-Fordist economy works with ideas. So a question what I asked a long time before, already 10 years ago for my PhD, was why are sometimes artists chosen and others not? And how does it work? How does it function? And I see there also an evolution in it. So my question was, why to engage this artist or even curator for this specific place? Why does this happen? Is it all about name and fame? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Is it because they are good organizers or good managers? Mostly they are not. We know, even the curators are not. But when they are chosen in a very integral sense, not for economical or political reasons, we see that they are chosen that everybody hopes they have a good idea, that they will bring a good idea. And what is a good idea? A good idea is still, in the modern sense in the art world, a new idea. You have to give a new idea to be in, or to be on the floor, or to say something. That is the classical thing. But what we see nowadays more and more, and it is going on since the boom of biennials, and I say certainly the last 10 years, that a good idea is also more and more appropriate idea. What curators, for example, nowadays do is see what the context is, and relate an exhibition to the context, the social, political, geographical context. It can be different things. So don't copy the same exhibition which you did in New York in Istanbul, for example. It's you get blamed for this. You have to be aware as a curator, but also as an artist, more and more to the context. So what we see is that a good idea is not only a new idea anymore, but also an appropriate idea, and you could call it an opportunistic idea. You watch for the opportunities at this local place. And we see it also in the methodology of a lot of artists and curators, which they use, for example, the interview, talking with people. What's happening here? What's the context? What is the political context? So this is to inform artists and to make also a good, fitting, appropriate idea. You see also that, especially, and I'm not talking about curators, that they are involved or contracted, for example, for biennials, because they hope, the director, the board, etc., they hope that they will deliver a new, good, and appropriate idea, which is fitting in the context. So again, here we see potency is very important, and also the promise. And we see this, and this is typical post-Fordism, says also Paulo Virno, the promise is capitalized, and is, if it is contracted, then this is contract. So not the exhibition, the final product, no, the promise to make a good exhibition and a fitting exhibition for this local context is contracted. So when this is going on, what we see here, what is contracted? An immaterial thing, an idea, a promise that something will fit at that place. What is important there is, of course, trust relationships. You have to trust people that it comes out, that it will work out. And now we come in with the idea that to control this, to build up trust relationships, to be, to see or to measure if a promise will come out in a way. The scene, and especially for the art world, the art scene is a production unit in a very classical way, is very productive and functional, this scene, in its social organizing in this post-Fordist economy. So what's a scene? First of all, we all know this, I think. Somebody who mentioned or observed and promoted the scene again was the very nice guy Richard Florida, who said, every city needs an art scene and a creative scene. It's a kind of economical good. So nowadays, the creative scene, what we see, evolved from the periphery in the 70s to the center of an economical and political system. For example, before the 70s, and I say it very blunt, we didn't talk about the scene of officials or the scene of administrators or the scene of lawyers, but we talked about the scene, the gay scene, the crime scene, the art scene. So it was everything what was in the periphery was mentioned as a scene, even also avant-garde. And this moves to the center, talking about the scene becomes more and more a very important thing. As a sociologist, I ask them, what is a scene? What is a scene about? What happens there? First of all, classical definitions is not a group. In a group, you have membership. You're in the group or you're out the group. That's not a scene. It's also not a subculture with very strict loading. For example, you only have to listen to this music to get in the subculture or not. But it has an identity, a scene. So it's like a subculture, it has an identity, but not that strict rules. It's also not a category, for example, like all young people of 15 years old, where they don't have an identity, they are a category. So what is it about the scene? First of all, we see a lot of scenes, and especially when we talk about the art scene, but also the fashion scene, design scene, etc. We see a lot of scenes at several places in the world. We have the art scene in New York, in Tokyo, etc. And what we see there is when you land, mostly literally with your plane in a scene, it's very easy to talk about the same subjects. For example, half a year ago, you said in an art scene in Tokyo, New York, or Brussels, Damien Hirst, and you immediately had a good chat with somebody, or you were in an intellectual debate about the subject. So there is a kind of shared reference in the scene, and this is very important. But you can easily go from one scene to another. So it's very flexible. This is also important. But the scene delivers you in a way, a kind of what I call urban intimacy. The relationships in the scene are professional, but also not professional. They are also informal. When we think of a scene, what is it? It are museums, but it is also the lounges, it are also the restaurants, etc. And most of the deals are made there, in this informal setting. So there is much more than only a professional relationship. There is also an intimate relationship not a very intimate relationship, but intimate enough to have also friendship relationships, etc. What we also see in the scene, and is very important in a post-Fordist context, is that the domestic and the working space are mixed up. And then, again, informality comes in as a way of, and I come to this, as a way of control, but also as a way of functioning. So, what is a scene? First of all, also we have to think at etymology of the scene that comes from theater. A scene which is not seen is not a scene. But also someone who is not seen on the scene is not on the scene. So it is very important to be seen, to be on the scene. And why is this important? Especially in an economy of ideas, it is... We know that ideas are very, how do you say, they can disappear immediately, or they come out immediately. So it is very important that there are other people around you, especially curators, but also artists, that you, when you say, I think I have a good idea, first of all, there's a trust relationship, but there has to be witnesses that you were the first with this good idea. And this is also, we know, this is a way of sanctioning and controlling in the art system. What is the main gossip in the art world? Oh, he has stolen this idea from this curator, etc., etc. So it is a way of controlling an economy of ideas, this, those informal relationships, and this scene on the scene. Okay. At the same time, the scene gives you the feeling that you are free, that you can jump from one place to another. And it is this cultivation of a kind of freedom, free to think also, free to have your own ideas and to develop your ideas, etc., which is in a way very productive. And then I came up with this. In a way, you see that there is an inversion of what Giorgio Agamben would call the Nazi camp, not that Arbeit macht Freiheit, but that Freiheit, freedom, makes you work in the art scene. And it is this feeling of freedom, this feeling what is cultivated in the art scene, which makes you free. I end up with this thesis, and don't go up in the figure because I want to give the floor to Michael Hardt, but in a way I want to defend the hypothesis and even the thesis that the art scene in a way also promotes the post-Fordist labor ethics and the kind of new spirit of capitalism. Thank you. Can we turn it off? Yeah. Although, yeah.
You would like to just have the projector on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there a light up here that? Well, that's good too.
It comes on. It takes a moment for it to come on. So I can also just...
I might do better without my notes.
Yeah, if you step to the front a little bit too close
Right.
to the mic, the light should be on.
Should be on. Okay, that's good. Okay, I'm Michael Hardt, and what I want to talk about is in a way an appendage or a supplement to Pascal's argument, and explicitly about, or particularly about, the effectiveness of critique. And I have to say also, I want to start out with that, you know, yeah, I'm not an artist. I don't really know that much about art. And so I was, if there were about 10 years ago, I would refuse all invitations to go speak in art context because, like, I don't know anything about that. But then I was convinced of, by, you know, a curator at the time, well, that actually in the art world there is the openness to want me to speak about what I actually know about, a certain kind of political theory. And so I was impressed by this
openness, and that also I learned at the same time that I have a lot to learn from artists about questions that I'm particularly interested in. So in a way, what I've got prepared is an elaborate way to ask you a question of a problem that I have that I think you as artists can solve better than me. And it's precisely about the questioning the effectiveness of critique. Okay, so to set that up, first that I wanted to just emphasize where Pascal is coming from and how I fit with this. So I definitely agree with and appreciate his argument about the coincidence of post-Fordist production capacities and the practices of the art world, about the coincidence between these two, and specifically the coincidence of a very high strata of the contemporary economy and certain practices within the art world. And in this way, or because of this, and as Pascal was saying about flexibility, mobility, experimentation, innovation, that these are all qualities of the newly dominant forms of labor, and especially the high end of the newly dominant forms of labor, which are common qualities, at least to certain aspects of artistic production and the art world. And so that artists have a newly central role in certain economic projects, certain projects of even urban economic development, of a kind of post-industrial economic development. Sometimes what Pascal was talking about, I find is much more common in a European context than in a US context. Like we don't have, or I haven't experienced in a US city, like urban planners that want me to speak about creative things because they want to create a post-urban development. But in Europe, it seems a little odd to me, and you say there are great opportunities, because there's money for the arts, but there's also, it fits within a urban development project of, as Pascal was saying, creating a creative city, et cetera, this sort of post-industrial creative city as urban development that artists are necessary for. Not only artists are necessary for, but the kind of ethic of artistic innovation is integral to. Now I'm still recounting Pascal's argument, and I find very convincing this notion about the proliferation of biennials as a kind of urban promotion project. Demonstrating the city's creativeness and innovation and relationship to artistic production as part of the interest of the biennial. Okay, so as a subset of this, and something that Pascal mentioned in passing, is about, as I said, the effectiveness in critique. Critique seems to be increasingly absorbed within the system, within this paradigm. In fact, what comes to my mind thinking about this is this sentence that Immanuel Kant quotes in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, about Frederick II, the ruler at the time. Frederick II says, or Kant reports it as him as saying, argue as much as you want and about what you want, but obey. So that there's this feeling of, okay, yes, do all kinds of critical activity, be as radical as you want, but in the end, function as part of the system. And that's the way I see, in a way, Pascal is presenting this paradigm. Okay, so to get started about this and thinking about critique, it coincides with something I've been working on and in some ways puzzled about, which is this, that in fact a friend and colleague of mine, Robin Wegman, and I organized a seminar around this and still haven't quite figured it out, which is a recognition that since at least the 1980s in the US universities in particular, there's been a mandate to be political. I would say mostly in the humanities and maybe only in a certain segment of the humanities, but a mandate to be political, like to demonstrate that your work is political and that you gain prestige, or it would be embarrassing if you didn't claim that your work is political. Like if you're writing about Chaucer or Shakespeare or working on Kant or any number of other things, that you have to demonstrate your politicalness. Often this has gone under the rubric of identity politics, and that the other thing we were recognizing is that primarily this is done in the context of critique. Like the critique is the mode of political intervention in which one demonstrates one's politicalness. And what do I mean by critique here? I mean, here's a summary way of approaching it. I'll talk a little bit more later. Think of critique here as revealing the structures of power and hierarchies in what was thought to be neutral and natural. You know, so for instance, say someone studying Kant, you might also reveal in Kant, who's claiming to and purporting to think in a universal form of reason, you might reveal the Eurocentrism of Kant's own thinking. For instance, reading his essays about race and anthropology and recognizing the whiteness of Kant and the Eurocentric nature of Kant's own thought, even from what he says. So in that sense, revealing revealing the structures of power and hierarchy in what appeared to be neutral and natural. So I think that, but this is also, I'd like to hear from you, I think that also in the art world, or in certain segments of the art world, there has been in the last 20 years that same mandate to be political, like mandate to demonstrate your work as political. And I think, this is the correlate of it, that has primarily taken place through critique, like through that demonstration of, and often I think in identity terms too. Now, I have an ambivalent relationship to this. Like, I'm not saying about the art world part, like leave me, recognize that I'm an outsider. But with regard to the humanities and this mandate to be political, the humanities, I mean, you know, like from people in English departments, philosophy departments, the social sciences too, anthropology, sociology. I feel ambivalent about it. I mean, on the one hand, I feel like, well, you know, what we get out of this often is these things that, you know, it's really not political. Like, don't try to claim that what you're doing is political. You're doing something great. You know, like you're writing, you know, like great things about Shakespeare. Just leave it at that. Like, don't pretend it's political when it's not. So I'm ambivalent in that sense. On the other hand, and also I do think that there's a great value in scholarship that's not political. I mean, I think that, but I'm ambivalent because what really gets me is then when I have colleagues who say, oh, no, we in philosophy, we never felt that mandate to be political. And I think, well, fuck you. Like, why didn't you? You know, like, didn't you really, like, so it's the same way you feel about identity politics. Like, I'm ambivalent about identity politics in the same way, whereas I, and, you know, I'm sure all of you too, would criticize certain things about certain structures or practices of identity politics. But here, what do I mean by identity politics? A kind of vigilance about constantly revealing the power structures and exclusions and that same way are presented as neutral and natural, like, and so that when someone says, oh no, we never felt the need to include women in our lecture series, and I said, well, fuck you, you should have, you know, like, you should have recognized that. And so that's why I'm ambivalent about it, you know, like, in the same way about this being political in the humanities. So I guess I have to leave, and similarly, okay, this is the kind of thing I wanted to ask you about, the mandate to be political in art, like either as curators or as artistic practices. I sense, I wouldn't be surprised if you feel a similar ambivalence, and that's one thing I would like to explore. But what I really am able to talk about is what I think is the primary mode of doing it, which, as I mentioned, is critique. And a certain dissatisfaction with critique. Yeah, and it comes, as I said, from the, I think, recognition that critique has become the primary mode of practicing theory. You know, now I mean the humanities, or social sciences, in the academy, let's say. At least theory conceived as political intervention. And I think it's not only me, I think there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction with critique. Now, the term critique can mean a whole lot of things. I gave you a little definition. Critique can also mean, in a very generic sense, fault finding. It can also mean methods to question the truth of authority. Critique as speak truth to power. You know, critique can also be techniques to reveal the figures of power that operate in the dominant discourses and ideologies. That's sort of like what I mentioned before, reveal the hierarchies within what's assumed to be neutral and natural. And then there's even the specific Kantian procedures having to do with Immanuel Kant that, you know, if you're not philosophy majors, you wouldn't know. The Kantian procedures, for Kant, critique involves investigating the limits of human understanding, reason, or judgment. And I will, unfortunately, talk about Kant a little bit later. So the differences among these modes of critique are significant, but all of them, it seems to me, today face the charge that they're insufficient as political methods insofar as they lack the capacity both to transform the existing structures of power and to create alternative social arrangements. So what's assumed to be the good of critique? There is, I think, an assumption in the political transformative capacities of critique that by revealing the truth, if people only knew, then the structures that were critiqued would change. Like that's what, and I think when that clearly doesn't happen, then results a sense of melancholy. In any case, even though I think there is a recognition of this lack of transformative capacities of critique, yes, so two things I'm saying really. Lack of transformative capacities, like by critiquing power, it turns out it doesn't overthrow it. And the other is the inability to propose alternatives. Okay, so that's the, and even though I think there's a generalized in dissatisfaction with critique, such expressions generally are not accompanied by a proposition of a different practice of theory as political intervention, or art as political intervention. Our field of theoretical possibilities are so limited, in fact, that the only alternative to critique often seems to be uncritical theory, that is, some method of affirmation of, collaboration with, or accommodation to the existing forms of power. So what I want to take the remainder of the time to talk about is what seems to me a proposition for an alternative. And so what I'm interested in particular, and what I want to recount to you, that will allow me then to ask you the art question, are the final 2 years of lectures of Michel Foucault at the Collège de France. So Michel Foucault taught, his teaching job, great teaching job, by the way, at the Collège de France. What you have to do there is you lecture for 10 weeks, and each of these lectures are now being published. Now the final 2 years, which are from the 82-83 season and the 83-84, they have been published in French. The first of these two was just published in English, I think, last summer, and the second one yet to be published in English. And they're all under the title, The Government of Self and Others. That's what the two-year set of lectures is about. And what I see in these lectures, as I'm saying, I think this is the way I read it, and I'll try to recount this in a minute, that they start with an expression of his dissatisfaction with critique, and they end with a proposition of a kind of militancy, what he calls it, of thought and action that I see as an alternative, as him trying to work towards an alternative to critique. So that's what I want to just try to explain, is what the dissatisfaction with critique is that Michel Foucault expresses, and what he conceives as this militancy that might be an answer to it. So just the preview, what I want to ask you really about what this notion of militancy could mean within artistic practice. Like, rather than thinking about artistic practice in terms of critique, what could this militancy be? Okay, so Foucault's fascinated, it's a weird setup, these 2 years of lectures, because most of them, all of them except the very first lecture, are about the ancient Greeks. And I'll recount those in a minute. But the first lecture is about Immanuel Kant, and particularly about the essay that I cited before that Foucault's totally obsessed with. Totally obsessed, I don't know. He writes about it 4 times. This essay called What is Enlightenment? And okay, I should back up a second. Kant's essay, it's a very brief essay, it's a newspaper article. It's asked by a newspaper. They say to a bunch of philosophers when Kant's writing, 1796, I think, they ask the question, what is enlightenment? And so Kant responds with this newspaper article, what is enlightenment? And what he starts by saying, his first answer, from the first sentence is, he wants to say, this is not an enlightened age, this is an age of enlightenment. And what enlightenment means is, he says, it's the exit from minority. Now, the exit from minority, he doesn't mean minority like, what he really means minority like is when you're too young to do something, or that's what the German word means, like, when you're too young to have sex, or you're too young, not that you have sex, but you're too young to legally have sex, or to drink beer. Those are exactly the German words for that. But then he goes on, or Foucault goes on to explain that it's what it really is that you can't speak for yourself, or you can't think or speak for yourself. So enlightenment, and I think this is what really inspires Foucault in reading Kant's essay, enlightenment is being able, daring to speak for yourself and to think for yourself. And in that sense, autonomy, that you can, autonomy that you're not obeying, but rather thinking and speaking for yourself. Yeah, it's not, Foucault explains, and it's totally, whatever, seems like obvious in the essay by Kant too. It's not immaturity in the sense that if it were just a matter of biological growing up, then you could wait 10 years, and then you would be able to speak for yourself. No, it's in fact a power that we always already have. Like, we already have the power to think and speak for ourselves. What Kant says, you have to dare to do it. Like, that's what, so the mandate that comes right at the beginning of the essay, sapere aude, dare to know. It's a challenge, and that's what enlightenment is that you're daring to know, think, and act for yourself. And that's the notion of autonomy that Foucault's excited about. So that, now, Kant himself is, as I said, if you don't know Kant, is center of his work is promoting a certain critical method. It's a little different, it's a little awkward here, but it's a little different than the critique I was talking about that you'd be familiar with from a certain garden variety, like critiquing the government or critiquing even an artwork, but it's somewhat similar. And this is what I wanted to get at, is why Foucault is dissatisfied with this. And he has two, what I think are really interesting ways of working out why he's dissatisfied with, like I said, he's really inspired by Kant's project of autonomy, of speaking and acting for oneself, but he's dissatisfied with Kant's critical method for getting at it. And so he does a very, well, it seems to me interesting reading of another sentence early in Kant's essay, which he takes as a challenge to critique. And the sentence is this is Kant writing still, but Kant says, if I have a book that gives me understanding for me, or if I have a pastor who teaches my moral conscience for me, or if I have a doctor who trains me how to live, then I don't have to think for myself. And so what Kant's in a way doing is that the role of the intellectual, or even of a certain kind of intellectual leader, is in some ways contradictory, because even though that philosopher writing the book, or the pastor who's training you in moral conscience, or the doctor who's training you on how to live, even though they're trying to maybe foster autonomy in you, like getting you to think for yourself, their very authority is contradicting with that possibility of autonomy. Does that make sense? And so Foucault turns that even further, and he says, isn't it interesting that those three things, this is only for the Kant adepts in here, otherwise you can not pay attention. Isn't it interesting those three examples refer to Kant's central three books, his so-called three critiques? That his first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, is really about development of understanding. And the second book, the Critique of Practical Reason, is about that construction of the moral conscience. And the third, the Critique of Judgment, Foucault realizes he's straining a little bit here, is like the doctor who teaches you how to live. And so that Kant, in a way, is reflecting and criticizing himself. His own major books are trying to teach people through this critical method to be autonomous, but in the very act of authority, they are an obstacle to the autonomy of the others. I don't know if that makes sense. And so then Foucault, he then picks up, now I'm just recounting a little more, but I hope it makes sense to you, in another of Kant's texts, this conflict of the faculties, in which Kant's reflecting on the French Revolution, and he says that these revolutions, he's putting them all together, always end up that the leaders tried to teach the people, to liberate themselves, but they end up undermining that revolutionary project by just establishing the authority of the leaders themselves. So it's a similar kind of dynamic of, what should we say, the conflict between authority and autonomy that's part of the critical project. Does it make sense? I mean, okay, let me try just a little bit too casual link to our notions of critique. Is there some ways that, can you imagine that there's some ways that the kind of critical practice that you're used to, either in humanities scholarship or in artistic practice, could have the same effect, like that there's the assumption that if you reveal the truth about, I don't know, Hollywood ideologies of Hollywood film, or or about any number of other practices. If you reveal the truth about it, that it will then inspire people or allow people to act and think for themselves, but that the very authority of the critical act undermines that possibility. Or that's at least what Foucault's playing with. Okay, so that's one, dissatisfaction with critique. His second is the dissatisfaction is that critique is unable to present an alternative. Like that what several years earlier, like I said, Foucault wrote several times about this essay. Several years earlier in a lecture of Foucault's that now has the title, What is Critique? I think that's the title of it, yes. And he's there, in that essay, he's not dissatisfied with critique. And what he's saying critique does is that it allows us to insist on not being governed so much, or not being governed in this way. But it doesn't, and this is what he says in the later essay, and this is where I think the dissatisfaction is, does not propose an alternative mode of governance. Like the critique is not able to make that proposition. Okay, I think you see where I'm going. So, as I said, this is the first lecture in a 2-year course of lectures. I'm not going to summarize for you, or I'd be happy to talk about, but I'm worried I'd bore you, the next 2 years. The next 2 years, he goes back to ancient Greek thought. And he does more or less 3 periods of ancient Greek thought. And he sort of, in his theme, what he says it's about, and what it is about really, is tracing this one concept in ancient Greece. Parrhesia is the Greek word, which translates more or less as truth-telling or free and frank speech. And he traces that through a number of philosophers. But in some ways, he has to be answering. He did the introductory lecture about critique here. These next 2 years have to be somehow answering the problem about what to do about it. Yeah, the short version, and I'm skipping, like I say, 2 years here. The first period more or less centers on Pericles in Thucydides' book. You know, Pericles' orations. I'm sure some of you know them. The second period is mostly about Socrates and Plato. And it's the third period that interests me most. So I'm going to just leave off a lot of it. What interests me most about the third period is now about the Cynics, the ancient Cynics. Because it's here that he proposes what I see as an alternative to critique in what he calls, a form of militancy, which seems to be different from critique. And I would call it a biopolitical militancy. So let me give you a brief description of it, and then I can sort of repose my problem and end. So Cynics, Cynic in Greece is dog, so it's a dog philosophy. Kynikos is dogs, and so these Cynics were dog philosophers. And so Foucault then goes on and tries to describe it as a dog philosophy. And it's a dog philosophy in, he had 4 ways. Let me put them together, though. It's in a way living a dog's life. See, that's important for him about this. He's saying, this is partly part of the narrative I've left out, is that really we have to recognize truth in one's life. Like that's sort of what these Cynics are taking from Socrates too. That you have to not only tell the truth about your life, you have to live a life that corresponds to that truth about your life. So even living a true life, which is, like I say, both telling the truth about and to yourself. This is what Socrates is doing, but also then living a life that corresponds to that. So he's reading the Cynics as extending that Platonic or Socratic idea about a true life, but doing it not in an ethical, individualistic way, but in a social, public way. Yeah. So the first way that they're like dogs, these ancient Cynics, the first ways in which they're dogs or have a dog's life. That's where I got on that distracting tangent about life. The first way it's like a dog's life is in their poverty and their exposure. Like they're like dogs in that they are poor, these ancient Cynics. I'm sure that all but 2 of you don't know anything about the Cynics, so just take my word for it. They're poor, and their exposure by which I mean they completely expose themselves socially. So partly what their actions are often about scandal. These are things that interest Foucault too. Scandal of doing things in public that others only do in private. So for instance, he's very interested in Diogenes or others of these Cynic heroes who will not only break social conventions by eating in public, but also masturbate in public. Like that's one that very much, so that everyone else does and are fine with masturbating in private, but the cynics doing it in public, like a dog exposed in public, is what is the first part of the dog's life here. Yeah, Foucault goes on about this part about Diogenes saying, if only everything were so easy as masturbating, like if only when you were hungry, you could just rub your stomach and it would go away, and like you would no longer be hungry. It would be like great. And so, but doing this in public is part of his, you'd figure that Foucault would like that. But, so this, a certain kind of scandal, let's say, of acting like dogs, exposing oneself. I mean, the poverty is in a way very, very, very similar to the exposure, and then scandalize. So, but then there's another aspect too. Let's call it the second aspect of the dog's life. Foucault doesn't conceive of the militancy of the cynics as only the power to scandalize. Two other aspects of the dog's life demonstrate for him the cynic's courage to attack and confront and combat the dominant society. Cynics bark and bite the social institutions and practices they oppose. And finally, cynics are vigilant guard dogs of a true life. Cynic combat, Foucault explains, is a voluntary and constant combat, an explicit aggression that is addressed to humanity in general, to humanity in its real life as horizon or object to change it in its moral attitude. But at the same time, and through that, to change it in its habits, conventions, its ways of life. So what Foucault identifies as militant life in the practice of the cynics is a struggle against the self and for the self. This is the way he says it, against others and for others. Cynics may not be the first to conceive of philosophy as militancy, he concludes, but they give it a distinctly open and violent form. So the cynics inherit from Socrates the focus on life and the identification of truth-telling with the true life, but they change it radically. Rather than the project to know oneself and care for oneself, the cynics aim, on the other hand, to attack the self in order to make it anew. And also, they refuse to separate the care of the self from the care of humanity as a whole, the government of the self from the government of others, which they equally seek to attack and transform. The only way to discover such a life, a new life, a life transformed, is to transform our world and to make of this world another world. Let me jump to one other part. I have one other thing prepared. The militant life of the cynics functions for Foucault as an alternative to critique as primary mode of theoretical and political intervention. This militancy is certainly not a rejection of critique. Foucault recounts, as I just said, how strongly the cynics attack the dominant social norms and institutions through provocations and scandalous actions. Like dogs, the cynics bark and bite. But militancy is not only critical. Militancy aims also at constructing a new life and creating, or at least prefiguring, a new world. Militancy, in other words, has an entirely different relation to governmentality than does critique. Whereas critique aims, as Foucault says, at the art of not being governed so much or in this way, militancy seeks to govern, but to govern differently, creating a new life and a new world. Yeah, so here's my question for you. I hope that this has been more or less clear. So what do I hope has been clear? On the one hand, this mandate to be political that has, I think, primarily taken the place through critique. The second is a certain dissatisfaction with critique's ability either to change the system we're criticizing or to create and propose a new one. And then this third, which I'm finding intriguing, is Foucault's proposal of a militancy. Why do I call it a biopolitical militancy? Because it has to do with the creation of new forms of life. Like, so biopolitical in that sense. This biopolitical militancy as something different than critique. And so, so that's what I wanted to ask you to think about the art world, or artistic production in this regard. So, this power to scandalize and the kind of things that titillate Foucault, about, doing things in public that others would only do in private. That scandalizing power, can't you think of infinite examples from the last 20 years of artistic production of performances and other artistic acts that scandalize in precisely that way? And I think, are critical in that sense. What I'm asking is it possible also to think about this creation of new forms of life as a mandate or a possibility within artistic production. You know, that not only scandalizes or not only critiques, but also is able to create new forms of life. And I mean not new forms of life as subculture, subset, but rather that addresses humanity as a whole. I mean, that's the other mandate he has about the cynics, which I thought was interesting. So, if critical practice lacks the political effectiveness, and I'd say even more so in the post-Fordist context that Pascal's working through, could this biopolitical militancy offer an alternative for artistic production? Or, here's another way of saying it, it's probably a better way of saying it. Do you see already artistic practices that do operate on this level of what Foucault, and I guess I am trying to think of as biopolitical militancy? That is that not only bargain by, you know, the institutions of and habits and social norms, but also create in a generalized social way new forms of life that can provide an alternative to the society that we're. I see a no already, but it would be, so I guess I have two questions for you. Like, could you teach me about ones that are already existing that I'm aware of, or could you imagine how his, this is what I was thinking about coming here, is that after having read him, I thought, oh, well, this may be something that artists know much better than others about this possibility of creating new forms of life that would, and in that sense, destroying this life for a new life and creating a new world. Okay, that's my question. I'm ready to stop. Yeah.
Thank you both very, very much.
Just stand.
And then we'll do a couple of questions from the audience, maybe for 10 minutes, for either one of the speakers.
Just one in the back or one in the front. Go ahead. Yeah.
Maybe
Go ahead.
if you would.
Yeah.
Michael, wouldn't that